Hi everybody. So this is the second part of our How to Do History slideshow. And last time we talked about the difference between history and heritage and how historians use both to try to understand history. In this slideshow, I'm going to go over the different kinds of sources that historians use. And the reason why I'm spending time to talk about this is because it's important to understand the differences between the kinds of sources that historians use to do history. Because in this course, we are going to be examining all different types of sources. And so I want to spend some time talking about what are the differences and how do we use these different sources. So, to start us off, we have basically three different kinds of sources that historians use. And they are designated primary sources, secondary sources, and tertiary sources. Now, sometimes students get confused when they see these terms, primary and secondary and tertiary, and they think that means, well, the primary sources must be the main sources that historians use, and then secondary sources are the less important sources. In this case, primary and secondary and tertiary doesn't have anything to do with their importance necessarily. It has to do with how close that source is to the past. So primary sources are first-hand accounts of a historical event. They are usually, but not always, written at the time the event occurred by someone who was somehow involved in that event. So as you can see in the definition that is given here, it's raw data. It's the original sources of information. It's first-hand observations. It's a contemporary account of an event or a viewpoint given at the time. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in just a minute about different examples of primary sources. Secondary sources are second-hand accounts of a historical event. They are usually, but not always, written after the event occurred by someone who was not involved in the event. And usually secondary sources will use collections of primary sources to build an interpretation of a historical event. So secondary sources are second-hand. They analyze and they interpret primary sources. They don't offer new evidence. And they are interpretations of information. They are written after the event. They offer a review or a critique or an analysis of that event. Tertiary sources are even kind of further removed from the event that we're talking about in history. They are accounts that usually summarize existing secondary sources. Things like textbooks, encyclopedias, dictionaries, websites like history.com or ushistory.org. These sources are not authoritative sources because there's usually very little or no peer review process. I'm going to talk about what peer review is in just a little bit. And because the authors of tertiary sources don't really engage in any primary source research. They are mainly just repeating what authors of secondary sources have said. They're compiling information and creating kind of a reference on a historical event. So historians don't really use tertiary sources all that much. They might look to like a website like Wikipedia or look at an encyclopedia article to check things like facts, like names or dates, but they don't rely on tertiary sources for scholarly historical interpretations. That's something that secondary sources provide. There's a video up on our Blackboard site that explains very nicely the difference between primary and secondary sources. And so I would encourage you all to kind of watch that video. So I'm going to talk about primary sources. Primary sources are, as I mentioned, documents that provide direct evidence of a period that you are studying in the past. They are materials that were created during or immediately after the era that you are studying. They are the raw materials of history, and they are essential to our consideration of the past. Without primary sources, we couldn't do history. But primary sources, we have to keep in mind a couple of things when we're working with them. A historian looking at a collection of primary sources can be compared to someone who's attempting to complete a 5,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. So it's a very tough thing to do. First of all, there's the fact that we are limited to studying only those sources which have survived over time. Many pieces of the historical puzzle are missing from the box. And the farther back in time that we go, the less likely documents are to have survived. And the sparser the historical record, the more likely we are missing key pieces of information, which could radically change our interpretations, our picture of the past. So consequently, our reading of the sources that we do have must be very meticulous and thorough. We have to mine primary sources for whatever information they can give us about that historical event or about that era. We really have to dig deep into our primary sources. Secondly, the primary sources that have survived from the past, they really can't give us a complete picture of any historical period. Because not everyone in the past was able to leave behind a record of their own unique experiences, the puzzle that is history is automatically going to be incomplete, even when we have examined all of the primary sources available. So a good historian should always try to keep these gaps or silences in mind when you're looking at primary sources. You have to be thinking about, well, what perspective, what opinion, what viewpoint is not being offered in this primary source. Now, as you can see on this slide, I've put a number of different examples of kinds of primary sources that you can look at. Newspapers, political cartoons, songs, diary entries, statistical data like marriage records, death records, census records, photographs, even material objects can be considered to be primary sources. So there are a whole array of different things you can use. So as I mentioned, we have to use primary sources, really mine them for information. Primary sources require active reading. When we read a primary source, like you guys are going to be doing this term, we are consciously trying to extract historically relevant meaning from it. And this requires a specific kind of thinking about and questioning of the material. So this is kind of a little guideline to help you get used to this process of questioning using primary sources. And the questions you should ask of your document can really be divided into kind of three different categories. There are the basic level 1 questions, things like, who created this document? Who's the author? Who's the creator? What do I know, if anything, about the author or the creator? What kind of document is it? Is it a law? Is it a letter? Is it a painting? What's the storyline? What is going on in the document? What event or series of events is this document or this primary source describing? Then you want to move on to kind of the deeper level questions, the level 2 questions. You want to think about, well, why was this document, why was this primary source written or created? And who, and this is a very important question, who was the intended audience? Now, when you're thinking about the intended audience, you want to be thinking about who was this directed to at the time that this primary source was written or created. So even though we're viewing it in 2020, we're not necessarily the intended audience, because the creator might never have intended that primary source to have been preserved. It could be, if it's a diary entry, it could be something that they never intended anybody else to see, but it has survived and we're using it as a primary source. So we have to think about, well, who's the intended audience here? This becomes very important, especially when we're thinking about, when we're using primary sources like speeches. So who would have been listening to this speech? Who would have heard it at the time? Who might have read it reprinted in a newspaper? There's all kinds of different things that you want to think about when you're thinking about the audience. You also want to think about the even deeper level questions, level 3 questions. What information can you extract about the era, about the time in which it was written or created? What can this document tell me that it might not intend to tell? Is there anything surprising to you in this document? We have to read between the lines a little bit sometimes. We have to think, well, sort of maybe the author didn't really intend this, but we can infer from the language that they use, we can infer the position or the perspective that they are offering. And then, are there any gaps or silences in this document? How complete a picture of the past can it give me? Does this document have a particular bias? I'm going to talk about bias in our next How to Do History lecture. But for now, just remember that you want to think about what this document is telling you, and then also what is it telling you that it might not intend to tell, and what are the kind of areas that are maybe silent in this document. So that's kind of how you want to approach reading primary sources and using them. Secondary sources, as I mentioned, are things like scholarly books or journal articles. And even though these are secondhand, even though they don't usually present first-hand accounts, they use primary sources to develop an interpretation or a historical narrative. They are telling a story about a historical event, and they are analyzing primary sources in order to craft that narrative or that story. Now, there are some advantages in using secondary sources. And the big advantage of using scholarly secondary sources is that usually these books or journal articles are peer-reviewed. They are very rigorously edited. They have been reviewed by anonymous reviewers. And this is a very long process to get a journal article or to get a book published. It can take a year or more for an article to be published in a journal, and even longer for a book to be written. First, the process that an author would take if you want to get yourself published in a scholarly journal, you have to submit the article or the manuscript, and then it's sent out anonymously to reviewers. These are other experts in that particular area of history. And they read through that article very carefully, looking for the strengths and the weaknesses of that article. Then the reviewers send their feedback and their recommendations to the editors of the journal, and they pass these reviews along to the author anonymously. So you don't know who's been reviewing your work, but you're getting their feedback on it. Now, the editors of the journal can either accept the article right away, and this hardly ever happens. They can reject it, which is far more likely, or maybe the likeliest of all, they can tell the author to revise and resubmit. And that means the author will have to go back and take the reviewer's comments and revise their work, and then they can send the article to the journal again. And usually at that point, the article will be accepted for publication, but that doesn't always happen. It's not a guarantee. So it's a very lengthy and rigorous process, and that means that the scholarship that you read in academic journals is really of the highest reliability and caliber. That can't be said for some web page that you might find doing a Google search created by, a history enthusiast, and, sort of that hasn't gone through any kind of peer review process. Anybody can put whatever they like up on the web. But these have gone through, journal articles and books have really gone through a really sort of strong process of review. Journal articles are especially useful, I think, because they're more concise than books. So if you aren't looking to read 300 pages on a topic, but you just want to get a general idea of what historians are saying about it, the journal articles are really the way to go for that. You can also mine the sources that are cited in journal articles or books for your own research. Authors have to cite their work, and they have to provide a review of relevant scholarship. Historians are having a conversation with each other through their published works. So in a journal article or a book, they will essentially say, well, here's what other scholars have said about this topic, and then here's what I have to say about it. You can also improve your own writing by looking at and paying close attention to how historians organize or present their arguments in articles or books. For example, most introductions, if you look at an introduction to a book or to a journal article, it usually follows a specific format. Usually they introduce the topic. Sometimes they do that by telling a little story to kind of hook the reader in. They provide some background information for the reader so that the reader really knows and understands what they need to know to go on and read the rest of the article. They articulate what question they are asking, the research question, and they present their thesis, which is basically the argument that they are going to make in that article or in that book. So this is a very standard format, and when you set out to write your own essay, you guys won't be writing essays in this course, but when you are, you can kind of follow this format. Now we do have to keep in mind secondary sources are another person's interpretation of the facts. So they're answering their own research question. It might not be the question that you might be interested in asking, but maybe it's similar, maybe it's a kind of adjacent question, and you can, kind of get a different perspective on a topic. Often, secondary sources assume that the reader is familiar with the topic. Like I said, historians are having a conversation with each other through their journal articles. And very often they will talk about things using some very, academic language. That's where a textbook or an encyclopedia article can be very helpful when you are just first starting out on your research, because it can give you kind of a basic understanding of the background information on a topic. But once you've gone through that encyclopedia article and read one, you basically know everything you would need to know about that topic in order to delve into your secondary sources. All right, so that's just a little bit about the main sources that historians use. And if you have any questions about this, please do feel free to post them up in the general questions forum. And next time, as I mentioned, I'll be talking about historical bias, so stay tuned for that. And hope you guys enjoyed the lecture.